Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, Deputy Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk by Jennifer Molinsky, who directs the Center's new Housing and Aging Society program. Before I introduce Jen, I have a few announcements. On February 23rd, which is next Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, the Center is co-sponsoring an online gallery talk for small infrastructure, a new exhibition focused on accessory dwelling units at UC Berkeley's College of Environmental Design, which is why it's at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. The exhibition, which was curated by Michelle Chang, a Joint Center faculty affiliate who teaches architecture at GSD, and Rudabhat Pakravan, who teaches at Berkeley, features ADU designs by 10 architects who teach at GSD or Berkeley. And it was prompted in part by trying to make sure that design is part of some of the discussions about the Build Back Better bill, which may or may not be resurrected. On Friday, March 4th at 12:15 p.m., the Center's Housing Research Center seminar will continue online with a presentation by Reardon Frost, a senior research analyst here at the Center, on his research into whether more people moved during the pandemic. Some of you may have seen the blog he wrote about this late last year. Really interesting findings. And on Thursday, March 24th at 6:30 p.m., both in person and online, Molly Wright Steenson, a professor of ethics and computational technology at Carnegie Mellon University, will kick off a two-day symposium on digitalization and housing with a keynote lecture on designing AI ethics in practice and in public. The symposium will continue all day on Friday and for half a day on Saturday. More information about the symposium and our other events and activities, including the many fellowships that we offer to graduate students who are returning to school in the fall, is available on the Center's website, www.jchs.harvard.edu. Now on to today's presentation. As I mentioned, Jen Molinsky, who is today's speaker, is Program Director of our recently established Housing and Aging Society program, an initiative that builds on the extensive research on housing and aging in the United States that the Center has been carrying out for several years, most of it under Jen's leadership. Trained as a planner, Jen is also a lecturer in urban planning at GSD. She'll be talking today about a soon-to-be-published working paper co-authored with our colleagues Samara Scheckler and Whitney Airgood-Obrycki that uses data from the American Housing Survey to assess whether our housing stock is meeting our accessibility needs. Jen will talk for about 30 minutes. I'll then moderate a Q&A that'll draw on questions I encourage you to submit via Zoom's Q&A feature. Whitney and Samara will actually be monitoring those questions, and where appropriate, we'll be answering them online. And of course, as always, apologies in advance if we don't get to all of your questions. We will keep a log of them, and in some cases, we may circle back to you if there's a point or a question that we really want to make sure gets clarified. A video of the talk, along with Jen's slides, will be posted on the Center's website by early next week. Jen, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. It's great to be here and to share this work. I'm going to share my screen and then get started. Okay. But it didn't start first page. There we go. So much of the talk I'm going to be doing today is based on the working paper that will be available next week on our website and the Joint Center's website. And I want to acknowledge and thank the co-authors of that paper, Samara Scheckler and Whitney Airgood-Obrycki. This was truly a team effort, and I actually really also appreciate their help preparing for today as well. And I want to say up front that the analysis I'll talk about today provides us some really interesting findings, but also raises some intriguing questions. We don't have all the answers, but as this is a research seminar, I'd really welcome your thoughts as well as questions in the Q&A. And the first thing I want to do is define accessibility. For our purposes today, I'm thinking of accessibility features in the home as those that make the home navigable and usable by people with certain long-term difficulties or disabilities. And these may include difficulties with mobility, such as walking or climbing stairs, grasping, bending, reaching. Accessibility features may also ensure that a home is usable by someone who is hard of hearing or has low vision or has cognitive difficulties. Typically, we think of these design elements as design elements in the home, physical design elements, but increasingly we can also consider how technology can make a home more accessible. Smart thermostats that can be accessed from one's phone rather than a dial, a thermostat dial high up on a wall, for example, which is something I'll come back to a little later. So today, just to give you an overview, I will talk first about the data that we have available to understand accessibility at the national level in the United States. And then I'm going to take a look at some older data that sheds the most light that we have on specific housing features and their prevalence. Third, and where I'll spend most of my time, is on the question asked in our new paper, whether people feel that their housing fits their needs, particularly if they have disabilities. And finally, I'll touch on efforts to improve housing in general, as well as programs that help individual people make their housing work better for them. So to the data, the best data we have around accessibility comes from the American Housing Survey, which is sponsored by the Department of Housing and Urban Development and conducted by the Census Bureau. The AHS is fielded every 2 years, every other year, and our most recent data is from 2019. The survey focuses on the physical condition and cost of housing, as well as demographics of people living in homes. And it does not regularly collect much data on accessibility, but there have been 2 special modules from which we have drawn most of our findings. And these were fielded in 2011 and 2019. They were different, they asked different questions. There's a little bit of overlap, but in general, the 2011 data focused on how accessible the housing stock is. It answers questions like what share of housing has a no-step entry or a lever-style handles on doors and faucets. And the second question, the one that we'll focus most on today, is better answered by the 2019 module. Do people have the housing that meets their needs? Can residents, particularly people with disabilities, get into their home, navigate through it, use the kitchen, use the bathroom? So while the 2011 data has been around for a while and we have featured it in many of our publications, I just want to quickly review what we know from that, and then I'll move on to the new data, or the newer data. So we have used this older data to look at 3 specific features, to look at many features, but 3 in particular: single floor living, meaning the presence of a bathroom, bedroom on the main living floor, a no-step entry into the home, and doors and hallways that are wide enough to accommodate a wheelchair. And we looked at these separately, one by different housing type, as you can see on the left of this chart, but also in combination. And by our analysis, only 3.5% of homes in the United States have these 3 things in combination. Single-family homes are among the least accessible by these measures, and the ones that are most accessible tend to be apartments in large multifamily buildings. That's the yellow bar. Many of these buildings have elevators, so steps aren't a barrier, and they offer single floor living, but still we're talking under 10% of units in large buildings have these features. And this is probably generous. There may be things that are not accounted for in the data. And we don't also know how some respondents to the American Housing Survey may have interpreted certain questions. This is a really complicated question to ask. If you asking somebody if they have a no-step entry into their home, does one count the vestibule step? Do you count 10 steps that are 10 feet away from the front door that lead from the street? So the information that we like to have is actually quite complex, and we appreciate how difficult it is to craft those questions, but it does pose some caveats on the data. And with those in mind, we did look at a couple other features. We looked at lever style handles on doors and faucets that are easier to grasp than the knob style, and electrical controls and thermostats that are reachable by a person using a wheelchair. And when we added into the 3 elements on the chart you see here, we found that less than 1% of the housing stock has all 5 of those features. And in all cases, by all measures, whether you're looking individually or together, the housing stock is the least accessible in the Northeast, where our housing stock is older, followed by the Midwest, and then the South and the West. If you're interested in learning more about what the 2011 data has to say, I would refer you to a couple of our publications. The first on this slide talks about what I just talked about on the previous slide. The second references a paper we wrote that finds that older adults living in subsidized housing are more likely to have accessibility features in their rental housing than those with similar incomes who do not live in subsidized housing. The third paper here listed here uses the same data to estimate the share of homes that are fully accessible, livable for those with moderate mobility difficulties, and potentially modifiable. And so while the researchers in this case estimate that 1/3 of all housing units could be reasonably modified should someone need to do so, they found that under 4% of housing units were deemed livable for those with moderate mobility difficulties. And just 0.15% of housing units were estimated to be fully accessible to someone who uses a wheelchair and prepares their own meals. Perhaps the most striking finding of that report was that less than 1% of units occupied by someone who uses a wheelchair could be classified as wheelchair accessible, which previews our next question, the fit between people's needs and their homes. And there are a couple other papers here too that also use the same data and come up with slightly different takes on it and are worth taking a look if you're interested. So the 2019 accessibility module focused less on specific features and more about questions about difficulties entering, navigating through, or using the home. And here are a couple questions, just examples of many in that module. And I just wanted to point out how these focus on the activity and not the feature. They're asking if someone can do something without assistance from another person. They specifically consider or ask that if it's not a long-term condition that results in the difficulty. So the second question, for instance, without assistance from another person, does anyone in the household 6 years of age or older currently have difficulty using a bedroom because of a condition other than a temporary injury? And then the question asks the respondent to consider activities like reaching and opening closets and windows and getting in and out of bed and getting dressed. These questions really resonate with a theory called person-environment fit that focuses on the interface between people and place. So the theory says that a person-environment fit that is poor can limit someone's ability to navigate and use their space so that they may need to rely on others for assistance. For example, someone who cannot walk up and down stairs may not be able to get to their washer and dryer if it's in the basement and therefore need to ask someone else or use someone else for help with laundry. Whereas if the machines were on the main floor and all the controls reachable to the user, they could do that task themselves. Another consequence of poor fit is that people might change their behaviors to avoid an aspect of a home that doesn't work for them, and these changes can have consequences for well-being. For example, someone with an inaccessible kitchen might have a hard time meeting nutritional needs, or someone with stability issues, but who doesn't have grab bars in their home or enough space to use a walker to navigate through, say, their living room, might use whatever's available to steady themselves, whether that's a towel rack in the bathroom or a piece of furniture that isn't really designed to support safe mobility. Research has shown that older adults in poor fit environments live with greater risk of falls. And overall, a poor fit between a person and a house can reduce functional capacity, increase reliance on informal support, and increase spending on long-term care services. And in contrast, good fit housing can increase independence and even stability of the living situation, allowing someone to live longer in a particular place because it fits their needs. Person-environment fit is at the core of environmental gerontology, which recognizes how important the environment is to people's experience in later life. Older adults spend the majority of their time in their home, and this is particularly true of the home environment. As people age, their needs may change, and the way they want to use their home or need to use it may change as well. So someone who may find that the kitchen they've used for years now poses challenges, the faucets are difficult to turn, or reaching an upper cabinet is no longer comfortable. But the theory also recognizes that the home environment can change too. The home, maybe parts of the home are deteriorating or not need maintenance, or alternatively, maybe someone has installed a modification to the home, like a chairlift that improves the fit with the home. So the 2019 data, AHS data, asks people to talk about how well their house fills their needs at the time of the survey. And that can be seen as really tying into the theory, not so much an inventory of accessibility features, but a sense of whether people feel their homes fit and support their needs. So what can we learn from this data? The survey explicitly asked if people had difficulties getting into the home, navigating to different rooms, and you can see those here, or using rooms without assistance, as I said before, because of a condition other than a temporary injury. And as our data show, over 5 million US households report that at least one member of their household has difficulty getting into and around their home, and 4.5 million report that someone had difficulty using certain rooms. This is roughly 4% of households, and I think the key here is this represents millions of households. The biggest single issue identified was actually getting into the home, followed by difficulty using the bathroom and the kitchen. And the questions in the survey specifically asked the respondent, when thinking about the kitchen, to consider reaching and opening cabinets and the refrigerator, turning on and off a stove, using the sink in the kitchen. And when it came to the bathroom, it was about reaching and using the sink and getting in and out of the tub or shower. And we've noted before what the bedroom encompassed to dressing and getting in and out of bed. So we don't know the extent to which a home's physical features or lack of features contributes to the difficulty reported by those surveyed. Someone with difficulty dressing may report a difficulty with the use of the bedroom. It's unclear if that's because the closets are hard to open or the rack too high to reach clothes, or if addressing those would resolve the difficulty. So the survey suggests that there are difficulties, but doesn't lead us to a particular intervention, certainly not in general, and not, of course, for an individual household. We can say with certainty that there are huge differences in responses by age. Older adults have much more difficulty with entering, navigating, and using their homes. As you can see, there's this steep climb in reported difficulties among those in their 80s and over, represented by those green bars. And this is across the board in all the elements that the survey discussed. And while the shares of households reporting difficulty increase with age, as we just saw, and as you can see on the right pie chart, in terms of sheer numbers, households headed by someone 50 to 64 and 65 to 79, the orange and the blue. The orange and the blue, yes, the orange and the blue, just wanted to make sure that's right, make up the largest number of households reporting difficulties. So the numerically, that's where the most difficulties are, but clearly by sheer percentage, 80 plus is reporting the most in terms of their share. Younger households are also significant. That brown pie slice in the first pie chart represents households under 50, and it's nearing, the same number of households that are over 80 as having someone in the house reporting a difficulty entering or navigating the home. So if it is a function of both the home and the people occupying the home, we kind of wanted to take a look at what was happening in older age that might be driving these fit difficulties. And the AHS survey asks people to report on specific difficulties they or someone in their household has with mobility, dressing and bathing, seeing, hearing, concentrating, remembering, and running errands. And again, you can see how this does increase with age. Less than 10% of households that are headed by someone under 50 report someone in their house has one or more of these difficulties, which is still significant when translated into numbers of households. But the share rises with age, and 60% of households headed by someone 80 or over has a resident with at least one of these difficulties, with walking and climbing stairs being the most commonly reported by up to nearly 40% of households in that 80 plus category. And then we can turn to the house. What do we know of older adults' homes that might shape housing fit? In the 2019 survey, we don't get that much information. That was all in the 2011 survey. But the 2019 data does reveal that the homes of older adults are more likely to have some features like a ramp or a no-step entry, having a bathroom and bedroom available on the first floor, or having a lift to a bathroom or bedroom, so there's no stairs involved, or single family living, which combines both of those two. So older adults are slightly more likely to have those, as you can see. And part of our paper also shows that those with disabilities are more likely to live in homes with these features. But despite this, as we saw a few slides ago, older adults report much more difficulty using their homes. And this may be because there are other needed features that are not accounted for here, such as walk-in or roll-in showers, accessible kitchens, et cetera. There are other explanations that are possible too. Even if a certain feature is present, a resident may still need assistance with bathing or dressing, for example. So there's lots of ways that we might interpret this data, but just sort of we wanted to explore both the person side and the house side and see where we could get, see how deep, how much understanding we could get. We also looked at a few other dimensions in addition to age. So looking at tenure, whether someone owns or rents, overall, owners and renters reported similar levels of difficulty, over all age groups. But at older age groups, there is some divergence, with renters in particular more likely to report difficulty navigating or using their homes. And as you can see, nearly 18% of renters in the 80+ age group have difficulty getting around their homes, compared to under 12% of owners. We might wonder if older renters are more likely to report disabilities that would make navigating or using their homes difficulty. And indeed, at all ages, renters do report slightly higher rates of disabilities. And we also can look at the house again, that the differences between owners and renters might be attributed to the housing that they occupy. Interestingly, in the 2019 survey, the few questions that did focus on specific features did not really show much difference. Renters were slightly more likely to report single floor living, but just slightly. And I think this is maybe a good reminder that rentals vary very dramatically. Rentals in small buildings and 2 and 3 family homes, or in small garden family style apartments, may be quite different than those in new high rises with elevators and much more accessibility features. And also worth remembering that nearly 30% of older adults who rent in single family homes. Poor housing fit is linked to income as well. And of course, renters tend to have lower median incomes than owners. In this case, though, lower income is linked to more difficulties using and getting around the home at all ages, as you can see on the far right in the gray box. But the differences, again, do expand with age. Poor housing fit is experienced by 20% of households with an adult 80 or over who are making less than $30,000 each year, as compared with about 11% of households that are living with more than $75,000 in income each year. We might expect that higher income households have more options for addressing deficiencies in their homes, either moving to something more appropriate or making modifications. Low-income households are definitely more likely to report someone in the home has a disability, particularly at younger ages. There's sort of an evening out that happens at older ages. And I think it's important to note that particularly for the younger age bands, living with a disability can increase chance of employment in low-income jobs. So there's just perhaps fewer employment options open. And of course, the reverse can also be true, where a low-income job that provides poor healthcare and riskier work conditions can contribute to disability. So there's really, we don't want to make any causal statements here, but just worth noting that low-income households have more disability and more evidence, as we just saw, of a poor housing fit. And when looking at responses by race and ethnicity, we see something a little different. Looking at all ages together, there are, again, in that far right box, there are fairly similar shares of white, Black, and Hispanic respondents reporting that someone in their home has difficulty getting in and around and using different spaces in the home. But when we do it by age, again, we see how at increased ages, Black and Hispanic households are far more likely to report difficulties. We did not include all race categories here because of thin sample sizes, but we would have if we could. So again, we don't know the extent to which the differences we saw in older age result from differences in disabilities or the suitability of the house. Again, this is households headed by a person age 80 and over who are Black are actually slightly less likely to report someone in their home has a disability, but we already saw that those disabilities might be experienced at an earlier age. So we're left to speculate, and that's really all we can do, as to whether households that report more difficulty with their houses in the last slide have less accessible homes. If they have multiple disabilities, that might more directly impact the use of the home that we can't see in this data, or something else. But fit does appear to be a more significant challenge for older people of color. And again, it's worth noting that due to the long-lasting effects of discrimination in housing policy and discrimination in housing and job markets, older people of color are less likely to own homes and more likely to rent, so therefore have lower incomes and also have lower incomes than white households, which again can limit housing options and the ability to modify space to address difficulties with housing fit. One group we wanted to look closely at are households in which someone uses a mobility device, such as a cane, crutch, wheelchair, or other device. Use of mobility aids increases with age, as you can see in the far left, the small box. And those households that include someone who uses a mobility device were more likely to report difficulty navigating or using their homes. 1/3 of those 65 and over who used a mobility device reported at least one difficulty getting around or using their home, compared to just 2% of older households where no one used a mobility device. So, that suggests that there are greater difficulties. But when you look at the chart on the right, which is about satisfaction with housing fit, most older adults, 65 and 80, 65, 79, 80 and over, who have someone in the home who uses a mobility device, were very satisfied with their housing fit. They thought that their house served their needs very well. And this is higher than the younger age groups. So more than 20% of households under 50 report poor housing fit, while just 10% of households 80 and over have a resident who reports poor housing fit, who uses a mobility device. And fully 60% of those 80 and over said that their house fits their needs very well. So this raises some interesting questions. There's something here to think about. Could it be that though older adults have more difficulties with their home and they report more difficulty entering and getting around, that their perception, their satisfaction of overall fit with the house is somewhat different than among younger households? Do older adults have ways of coping with poor housing fit that are hidden in the survey? So while they acknowledge the difficulty, they're still overall satisfied with their housing. The answers to these questions are important because they speak not only to policy that addresses these gaps, but also how we understand them and how we communicate about them. The difference between observable fit measures and self-rated measures raise interesting questions for further research, including how perceptions of good housing fit align with these objective measures. Does your house have that? Is this difficult? Is that not? And also with the home modification choices that residents make. And to end the data portion of this talk, on another curious note, clearly the Northeast and Midwest are still less likely to offer certain accessibility features when you look at the chart on the left. While we can't directly compare this to our 2011 data, it totally lines up with the idea that housing is less accessible in the Northeast and the Midwest, less likely to have no step entries and single floor living. And respondents, if we look to the right end of the slide, respondents in the Northeast were not surprisingly, most likely to say someone in the household had a difficulty entering or getting around. But there's interesting kind of flip between the Midwest and the South there, with respondents from the South indicating more difficulties in the region, almost to the level of those in the Northeast. And so again, questions, is this a result of different demographics of the residents, of features of the home that aren't captured in the survey, but that shape how residents respond when asked about their difficulties? We don't know, but I think we can't solve this puzzle with any certainty. It's yet another finding that points to the complex relationship between the physical house and its features and the people who live in it. I want to end on the very high level view of what we do about the lack of accessibility in our housing stock and about the housing fit on an individual level. And each of these really demand different actions. In terms of increasing the overall chance that a home will have accessibility features or universal design features that can be used comfortably by all people, some communities and states are requiring accessibility features in new construction, specifically in new single-family homes, which haven't had other ways of addressing accessibility. Vermont, for example, requires some basic features in all new developer-built single-family housing, and some other states require accessibility features in all new affordable housing. With regard to multifamily housing, there are various laws that cover accessibility at the national level, and states often have their own additions as well. ADA covering public and common areas, Fair Housing Act requiring some features in each apartment, like doors have to be wide enough to be usable by someone who uses a wheelchair, light switches and other controls have to be in accessible locations. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of, I think, 1973 has requirements for accessibility in subsidized properties undergoing rehab. But creating more accessibility in multifamily housing is a big concern. And I would draw your attention, if you can see it in the notes, to an excellent article here about steps to improve accessibility in multifamily buildings. And these notes, these slides will be posted on our website. So if you miss anything, they'll be there early next week. The other question is how we ensure that people who need to improve their housing fit can do so now. Improving the overall accessibility of the stock is a very worthwhile goal, but what do we do for people now whose homes don't meet their needs? And a first step is helping people to understand their options and the routes to improving accessibility and usability of the home. There are a lot of checklists. AARP has one, local councils on aging and other organizations provide checklists and guidance to help people make determinations about how best to improve the fit with their home. And there are, of course, professionals who can come to one's home and help with this. In terms of funding these modifications, which depending on what they are, can be expensive, there are some federal programs that offer assistance to veterans, for example, and Medicaid home and community-based care waivers can be used in some states to make certain home modifications for those who qualify. But these programs can be narrowly targeted to residents with specific documented disabilities, and they typically fund only particular types of modifications. One thing that we are keeping our eye on is that Medicare did recently expand to cover certain modifications in the home by classifying them as durable medical equipment, which has been covered by these programs. So that's something we're watching. State and local programs may offer no interest loans, grants, tax credits, and others to make modifications to offering these most typically to homeowners. And about half of states have created funding programs for older homeowners to modify their home for accessibility. In Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Home Modification Loan Program, for instance, offers deferred payment loans of $1,000 to $50,000 for eligible projects, and it's not restricted to people who are older. The loans don't accrue interest and are repaid upon home sale or change of title. But most programs are only, again, available to those with documented disability, and they don't help people make proactive changes that will increase the safety and usability of their homes over time. And again, they may be narrowly targeted and have income limits. There are nonprofit programs that may offer assistance to low-income households seeking to make modifications, such as some Habitat for Humanity chapters, or Capable, a program that has gotten a great deal of well-deserved attention because it combines an occupational therapist, registered nurse, and handy worker who together address modifications in the home, but also help occupants gain strength and stamina and techniques to help them use and navigate through their homes. Most of these programs, again, assist homeowners, and renters may need particular assistance with modifications. Accessibility modifications are typically provided and paid for by the owner in subsidized housing, as our paper, an earlier paper shows. But those living in market rate units may need to pay for modifications themselves, even when the modification is deemed reasonable under fair housing law and has been approved by the landlord. And since the rentership rate increases among the oldest households, we see the homeownership rate trending down, and when people are in their late 70s, and the rentership really increases among households headed by someone in their 80s. Assisting renters 80 and over to achieve satisfactory housing fit will be a growing challenge. I think on the renter side, I'd be remiss if I didn't also say that basic rental support is extremely important for low-income people who have disabilities and who already have limited housing options to improve their chances of finding not just affordable housing, but that meets their accessibility needs as well. Hold on, sorry about that. Sorry about that. So technology is shifting the conversation. Smaller profile mobility devices, stair climbing wheelchairs, smart home technology. This may all be in the future and may really allow for us to address accessibility needs without making physical interventions in the home, or maybe not as extensive. But again, availability and cost are significant issues here. And many people, particularly older adults at upper ages and those with lower incomes, even lack the internet access that you would need for the smart technology to begin with. So something that offers promise, but is not quite here yet. So I'll just end by saying that over the next 20 years, households in their 80s will be the fastest growing age group. We've seen in these slides how housing fit can change in those years, and needs can change. At the same time, there are millions of households of all ages that could benefit from increased accessibility in the home. And I think there are a lot of promising programs out there. I'm sure among this listening audience, there are many that you know of many that we don't know about, and we'd love to hear about them. And I think the challenge is really about scale and about extending these to more and more people of middle income who still may not qualify, but still have really difficulty making these changes, to people who want to make changes proactively rather than when an emergency occurs and they can no longer use their house. So I think there's a lot out there and a lot of promise and a lot of work to do. So I'll end there and turn back to David.
Jen, thank you as always. Just I think there's an incredible amount here that's really useful. There's a bunch of really interesting questions that have come up. Let me start with a couple people asked, do we know anything about, or what do we know about the types of households, particularly, is there any way to get at the data about people who are living alone, people who may be living with somebody else, but both people are older, and people who are, in a kind of multi-generational household? And I guess the other flip of that is, if we don't, what would be the kind of questions you'd want to, what might you expect to find, or would you want to be looking at?
Yeah, we started to look at that. It didn't quite make it into the paper, but I think there's still work to be done to mine that. Single people tended to have better fit, which frankly surprised me. It was not my expectation, because single person households, especially older ones, often have lower incomes, and associated with that can be more disabilities. But I think to be able to live on one's own requires, a certain amount of housing fit that really works. You don't have someone else there to help you compensate. So we do know that is one of the findings, and that I am going to, yes, sorry, here we go. That it's people living with, let's see, other family and non-family report more difficulties than those who are married, living as a couple with no children. And part of that is also, it's again, that people can help each other sort of navigate or use a home. If somebody can cook and the other person finds the kitchen inaccessible, whereas that may not be the case in others. But Whitney and Samara, you can please chat in or even speak up here if you have a better answer than I do.
Of interesting questions about why, why so little of the stock is in fact accessible. And one person framed it as saying, do you think the main barrier here, and this is clearly not a question you can answer from the data, is why aren't more builders and developers building accessible housing? Or perhaps you're starting to see signs that they are. And related to that, is it your sense from the discussions you've had that the lack of housing is because it's just so expensive, or it's just, well, that's the way we've always built housing and it's kind of force of habit?
Yeah, I think there's a conversation that I hope we're getting to a new point, but there's a concern that accessibility modifications are institutional in look, that they are not desirable design elements, but that I think is where universal design comes in, the idea of making something beautiful and seamless that's usable by all people. That is something that we need to incorporate into our housing. And I think this is where you see single family houses and also small multifamily have been left out of this conversation. That Fair Housing Law, Americans with Disabilities Act has addressed some of the challenges in larger buildings. But that's where these ideas are coming from, that we need to create regulations or incentives that some of these things, the navigable hallways and doorways, those are hard to change later. So if we can get them in now, the bathroom on the first floor, putting blocking in the bathroom wall so that you can put a grab bar in later. Maybe a little bit more expensive up front, but certainly a lot more cost effective than tearing out that wall later to put the blocking in, to put the grab bar. So, you know, I think the conversation is getting around to this, and I hope that we're going to be seeing more of this. But I think it's also something that it can be challenging for some people to think about, and they have certain ideas about what these things look like.
I want to shift to there were two interesting questions about kind of the larger neighborhood and urban context. And the first, which in a way I think goes back to the AARP project that you were involved with, is do we have any information about the relationship between whether or not housing is or isn't accessible and what we know about the neighborhood? So I could live in a perfectly fine house, but if I'm living in a totally car-dependent neighborhood, that's still a problem. And I don't know if there's any way to lay this data against some of the data that I know you've collected, that's been collected on what do we know about the larger neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think we can make some generalizations, but it's probably going to vary by specific neighborhood. But neighborhoods that have more complete streets with sidewalks and, crosswalks and public transportation and bigger buildings that have elevators, some of that does go together, where single family houses in general tend to be less accessible, often out further in suburbs where you don't have sidewalks and all that. So I do think there are connections between these two things, but of course there's exceptions and things going in different directions in every neighborhood. So.
I was actually just thinking that I could imagine the counterfactual of a lower density but walkable neighborhood that's older houses, some of the kind of classic Northeast neighborhoods where the neighborhood might be really accessible, but the houses almost certainly aren't.
Yes, I can think of some neighborhoods around here where that's definitely true, where we have T and we have the sidewalks, but we have older triple deckers and Victorian houses that are not accessible.
A different neighborhood question was given often that people with mobility, older people, as you mentioned, and people with disabilities are lower income, one could imagine that they are more at risk of displacement from gentrification. And again, I don't know if we know anything from the data about the relative moves by the kinds of people who were responding to the survey with problems. That was an inarticulate question, but I think you know what I'm saying.
Not from this data, no. And I think that's a very real concern. And I think what I was trying to say at the end about rental assistance is just how challenging it can be to find, if you have a voucher, to find the housing that fits your needs. And if you have accessibility needs, that's extra challenge. And the fact that we only serve a quarter of people who qualify for rental assistance. So I do think that's a very significant issue.
There have been a couple of questions that have come in about the role of supportive services. There was one that said, and again, I'm sure the data won't tell us this, but I'm asking to draw on some of your other expertise. For example, the role of OT, or the role, what do we know about folks who are in more communal living situations? Again, I don't know, I doubt that's in the AHS data, but I don't know if it's shown up in some of your other research.
Well, certainly the Capable program is an example of a program that tries to bring both together the accessibility features in the house, and their handy person will go make modifications that are in keeping with a person's goal. So if their goal is to be able to use their kitchen more effectively or to get up and downstairs, they would focus on that. And then the occupational therapist and the nurse, they devise a plan to help someone develop the stamina or the strength or whatever it is, especially if they haven't been able to use the stairs for a long time. So those are definitely programs that bring both of those together. And yes, our other work, we have a body of work focused on supportive services for older adults. These things really, I think, need to be thought of as going together. And the home, I didn't say this before, but home accessibility is important for caregivers too. If you're trying to help someone navigate a house or bathe or dress, having those accessibility features in the house is important, and those things come together in that way.
There were a couple questions just about model legislation or model codes that you might point to both either encourage the construction of more accessible housing or some particular programs that might help with the renovation that folks might want to look at.
Yeah, and I would invite Whitney and Samara to chime in here too. I think the visitability is a movement that's been since the early 90s in the making, and not as widespread as we could need, as we could use. But I think it is really important for that. It's slow, we only add so much new housing stock every year, but a really important thing to be thinking about and considering that for rehabilitation too. How can we make apartments that are rehabilitated or homes that are really rehabilitated more accessible in the process, I think are really important. So visitability.org has some great resources for that. And then then more thinking about loan programs, no cost loans or no interest loans or grants to help people finance these things is another important thing. And again, these exist, and I think we're getting there. We're getting some recognition too from Medicare and Medicaid that housing accessibility is really important. Keeping someone in their home is a lot better in general for many people and cheaper than moving to a nursing home because you can't get in and out of the home. These things make a lot of sense, but again, the need is tremendous, and I feel like we're getting there, but not quite as fast as we need to.
And could you talk for just before we move? I don't know if there's any more you want to say about the new program that you're heading. You clearly have a bunch of people who are interested in the topics. What is it that some of the aspirations? What should people be looking for over the next several months about from that program?
Yeah, it's very exciting. I think just the demographics show the importance of really addressing housing needs for an aging population. And part of what we will address is the physical house, and the accessibility is a big part of that. And this paper that we'll have coming out soon is a big part of that. And we look forward to working with our colleagues at the Joint Center in remodeling futures on this too, because we both have an interest in this from different angles. But we are also looking at affordability, the affordability of housing for older adults. About a third of older households are unaffordably housed by our measure, paying more than 30% of their income on housing. So that's a big area for us. Supportive services and long-term care and all that enables someone to stay in their home is really important. So we're really thinking about housing not just as the physical box of the shelter or as the cost of it, but what does it take to keep you in that house? And for older adults, that might mean a lot of different things than it does for younger households. And so looking at that, we have some great work that Samara has been working on service coordination and the role that service coordinators have played in delivering services to people in their homes, typically people living in senior housing, not dispersed through the community, but there's lots of potential there. I guess the last thing I'll say is that to us, housing options and housing solutions is going to be an important part of this program. We want to lift up and identify things that are working and different models. And so one of our projects is looking at multi-generational communities and how those work and how those might offer an alternative to some people. And so there's a lot that's coming down the pike, lots of new reports and projects, and really excited to be working with Samara and continuing to work with Whitney and Bailey, who is also on our team.
I'll note for folks that we have always on the Joint Center's website, but now, and kind of new and improved. The range of research that's been done, I think, is really that this is building off of is really quite stunning, and it's been really striking to watch folks who are interested in dealing with an aging population discover that, geez, goodness, housing is part of that, ought to be part of that discussion. This is really a wonderful interdisciplinary field. Just a couple of last questions. There were a couple of questions of folks basically saying, given what you're finding, given the growing number of older Americans, either are you in discussion with folks about what kinds of questions might get asked on surveys, or more broadly, if you were, or if you are, what are the kinds of things that we don't know the answers to that might lend themselves to being part of census, American Community Survey, American Housing Survey, et cetera?
It's a great question. And we did between the 2011 and the 2019 modules have conversations with colleagues in the field at other organizations and with at HUD and at Census. And I definitely gained a very strong appreciation for how difficult it is to craft questions. As I said, how do you convey exactly what you mean? And then we realize, it's not always obvious what we mean. Housing is so different. And I think a challenge too is that people who may not be living with disabilities or have someone in their household, it may be harder for them to assess whether the door is wide enough. So, the questions about accessibility require maybe a little bit more work on the part of the respondent to answer. And so it is really hard, but I would love to have more insight into the features of the home. I think this 2019 survey was really important in terms of pointing out that features don't, resolve all problems, that there are difficulties with fit, even if someone is living in a house that is so-called accessible or has single floor living. But I think it just points to now we want to know, well, why, what exactly is the impact? What makes using the kitchen so difficult? What makes using the bathroom so difficult? And so as difficult as those questions are to craft and ask, it may be that it's a smaller study, but that's something I feel like I'd love to return to. I'd love to kind of bring these two together more.
Just picking up a couple of other threads in the questions here in our last few minutes. There have been a variety of questions around getting the funding is one thing. Finding a contractor who you both trust and is competent is really challenging. And again, I'm wondering if in the course of doing this work, you've come across any interesting models of how basically how to make sure that people are working with people who can do what they're supposed to do, and do it in a way that encourages trust.
Yeah, there was an AARP survey a couple of years ago that identified this as a big concern of people who wanted to stay in their homes was, how do you find the person? How do you find someone you can trust and you can afford? I think that those people are out there. There's there are certification programs for aging in place contractors. So, that might be one way, but I think the problem is actually the first step. Like, people don't know that they exist. So even finding them is really hard. And so, yes, I have visions of some kind of clearinghouse of information, but as of yet, I think it's largely local thing of going to your council on aging or senior center or area agency on aging, and kind of trying to find advice and guidance as you can in your area.
I guess the last question is, was there anything that you found in this data that was especially surprising? And I guess the related thing, once you answer that, is, as folks kind of walk away from this talk, what are the 2 or 3 things you really want to make sure that people take away from, what you found in the data that you, again, think were particularly they might have been what you expected, but are still really striking. So any surprises, and what are the most striking findings in your mind?
I think one of the surprising findings was how the extent to which, and I think the survey only asked this question of people who use a mobility device. So it wasn't asked of everyone, but people who use a mobility device recording a high level of difficulty entering, navigating, using their home, but also a very high level of satisfaction with their homes. So puzzling that out, I think, is really interesting and important. And the satisfaction increased with age when the difficulties also increased. So what is that about? I think that there's, like I said, I think there's some interesting story there, and it may have a lot to do with perception and people's own assessment of their housing fit versus how we are measuring it. And I think there's a lot to be done there. And I think in terms of the bottom line, the takeaways, we just have deep gaps between what people need and want in their homes and what they have if they have disabilities. And we know that this is, I think, big takeaway that wasn't surprising is that poor housing fit is more common among people with lower incomes, that there's increasing disparities in housing fit for older households of color compared to white households at the oldest ages. And that this is an issue for people of all ages, but just that we're going to see a doubling of the 80+ population in the next 20 years adds a great urgency to it, to us addressing these problems.
More and more people are going to look like me. I really, every time we get to have a presentation from you and your colleagues working on this, I think it's fascinating. I think it's really important research. I would just add to your list, I was just looking down my notes of what really struck me was, I mean, the sheer just the actual numbers of people, but a point you made earlier about in aggregate numbers, the number of younger people who have mobility issues and disabilities, and that this becomes not as many of the people in the very, very rich Q&A online piece have pointed out, this is not just an issue for older folks. Well, I'm really excited to be here kind of at the start of the new program. I know it's going to continue some great research. I encourage folks both to visit the Joint Center webpage to see what we've done and sign up to see there's some wonderful things coming down the pike in this and in other areas. And Jen, I know you're extraordinarily busy these days, including writing a paper for the upcoming symposium. So I thank you for taking the time to prepare for this and of course to do it, and thank everyone for coming. And again, apologies for not getting to everyone's questions. And thank you to all of the people who put in information about programs.
I look forward to reading that. Yeah.
That's actually really, really helpful for us. We will hopefully see some of you, or see at least your names on the screens in 2 weeks for the next Housing Research Seminar. Until then, I hope everybody has a great day and a great weekend. And again, thank you, Jen. Thank you, Samara. Thank you, Whitney. And thank you, James Chackness, as always, for all the stuff you do behind the scenes. Have a good day, everybody.